You stopped explaining yourself sometime late in your 40s. The decision was not made. It arrived, a meeting ended, or a phone call did, or a sister sent the message she always sends, and the sentence you would have constructed in your own defense did not assemble itself. The words were available, the will to spend them was not. This is the moment the title points to, though it does not name it directly. The quiet collapse Jung described is not the noisy collapse. The culture knows it is not the breakdown that produces hospital records, leaves of absence, prescriptions adjusted upward. It is the structural collapse of a self that was organized around being legible to people who never intended to read carefully. The collapse is quiet because the apparatus that would have made noise has already gone offline. The mouth that would have argued is closed. The body that would have braced has stopped bracing. The performance has not been refused, it has simply stopped happening. The way a building stops being heated when the contract ends. Jung wrote in Aeon about the moral problem of the shadow, but the shadow in this case is not yours. The shadow belongs to the systems that required your visibility for their own coherence: family, workplace, friendship circles, romantic structures. Each of them depended on a certain frequency you were broadcasting. The frequency was your availability, your willingness to be reached, interpreted, summoned, soothed, mobilized for the emotional housekeeping of people who never asked themselves why the housekeeping was always done by you. The collapse is quiet because the broadcast has ended and the receivers are still tuned to a channel that no longer transmits. Most empaths do not survive this. The phrase only 1% is not hype. It points to a structural reality. The vast majority of people in this position will fold the broadcast back on. They will return to the frequency because the silence is too disorienting. They will mistake the collapse for depression and treat it. They will mistake it for spiritual failure and seek a teacher. They will mistake it for relational damage and try to repair the relationships that depended on their fragmentation. Each of these moves is a way of reactivating the transmitter. Each of them ends the collapse before the collapse has done its work. The 1% is composed of those who let the silence finish its sentence. You may already know which group you are in. You may not. The recognition is not pleasant in either direction. If you are in the larger group, the recognition arrives as a faint nausea, a sense that you are about to ask for something that will undo you. If you are in the smaller group, the recognition arrives as a colder clarity, the awareness that the people who used to find you have stopped, and that this is not a loss, but an architectural fact you had been postponing. There is a distinction here that matters. The quiet collapse is not the same as withdrawal. Withdrawal is a movement made by someone who still believes the other person is watching, still believes their absence will register as message. The quiet collapse is what happens after the listener understands that their absence will not be read as message, will not be read at all, because the readers were never reading, they were extracting. The collapse is the moment the extractive economy is shown to have been an extractive economy. There is no protest, there is no announcement, there is only the cessation of supply, and the readers, slowly, finding other suppliers, or pretending not to notice that the supply has ended. Jung used the word participation mystique to describe the unconscious merger between psyche and environment, the state in which the individual cannot distinguish their own feeling from the feeling of the field around them. The empath, who has not yet collapsed, is living inside participation mystique without naming it. Their nervous system is reading the room before they enter it. Their mood is calibrated to the mood of the person they are about to meet. Their sense of self is constituted by the demands placed on it. They believe this is sensitivity. It is, but sensitivity is not the description. The description is structural permeability, and the permeability was installed early by environments that needed it. The quiet collapse is the moment the permeability closes, not because you decided to be stronger, not because you read a book on boundaries, because the nervous system reached its threshold and the membrane, having been asked to remain porous beyond its design, sealed. The sealing is involuntary. It feels from inside like becoming colder or duller or less feeling. The culture reads this as a problem. Jung would have read it as a phase. The membrane is not broken. The membrane is finally closed. For the first time since childhood, what happens next is the test. The test is not whether you can keep the membrane closed. The membrane has closed on its own. The test is whether you can tolerate what the closure reveals. Because the closure does not produce peace. It produces vacancy. The systems that depended on your permeability begin to fail in real time. The friend who used to call when she needed to feel heard calls less. The family member who used to soothe themselves by upsetting you finds the upsetting no longer produces a useful response. The partner who used to extract reassurance discovers that reassurance is no longer being manufactured. None of these people will say what is happening. Most of them do not know. They only know that something has gone wrong with the supply, and they will briefly attempt repair. The attempts at repair are the harder test. They will not look like attacks. They will look like care. They will look like sudden interest in your life after years of disinterest. They will look like concern about your well-being, framed by people who have never asked about your well-being in any sustained way. They will look like invitations to events, requests for advice, sudden vulnerabilities offered as if for the first time. Each of these is a probe. Each of them is the system testing whether the broadcast can be restored. The empath who survives is the one who recognizes the probe without naming it, who lets the probe land without responding to it, who does not perform the role of the person who is being cared for because she knows the performance would be the reactivation of the very channel that just closed. Jung wrote that the persona is the mask we wear for the world, but more precisely, the persona is a contract we sign with the world about which parts of us are eligible for traffic. The quiet collapse is the unilateral termination of the contract. The other parties have not signed anything new. They are still operating under the previous terms. They will, for some time, treat you as if the contract is still in force. Your task, if you are in the 1%, is not to announce that the contract has ended. Your task is to live as if it has without explanation, until the other parties understand that the silence is not negotiation, the silence is the new arrangement. This is what makes the collapse quiet. There is no document, there is no ceremony, there is no conversation in which you tell the people who depended on you that the depending will not continue. The conversation would itself be a final transmission, a last broadcast on the channel you have closed. Closing the channel and then transmitting an explanation of the closure is, structurally, leaving the channel open. The 1% understand this without being taught, the 99% send the explanation, and the explanation reopens everything, and the membrane begins to ache again. And within months, they are back inside the participation mystique. They almost escaped. The mechanism by which the membrane reopens is worth examining slowly, because the mechanism is not what the culture teaches. The culture teaches that boundaries fail because people are weak, or because they have not done enough inner work, or because they need to learn to say no. None of this describes what actually happens. What actually happens is that the closed membrane produces a specific kind of discomfort the psyche has never tolerated. And the psyche, untrained, reaches for the most familiar relief. The discomfort has a name in the older literature. It is called the void of relation. Jung circled it without using that phrase, particularly in his late work on the conjunctio, where he described the interval between the death of one structure and the formation of another as the most psychologically dangerous interval in the entire individuation process. The interval is dangerous because nothing in it feels like progress. Nothing in it feels like growth. It feels like absence. And the empath, who has spent a lifetime filling absence with her own substance, does not recognize absence as a legitimate state. She recognizes it as failure. The membrane reopens because the psyche cannot, at first, distinguish between healthy emptiness and pathological lack. The two feel identical from inside. The cold clarity of the sealed self and the cold despair of the abandoned self produce nearly the same somatic signature. The pulse is slower, the appetite is reduced, the interest in the people who used to fill the days has diminished. The body that used to anticipate the next demand now anticipates nothing. To a system trained on demand, the absence of demand reads as catastrophe. This is where the second mechanism enters, and it is more subtle than the first. The empath does not simply miss the demands, she begins, slowly, to author them. She begins to imagine that the friend who has not called is in distress. She begins to wonder whether the family member who has not reached out is unwell. She begins to construct, in the silence, the very emergencies that would justify reopening the channel. The construction is unconscious. It does not feel like fabrication. It feels like intuition. The empath has spent decades being told that her intuitions about other people are accurate, and so she trusts the construction, and she reaches out, and the channel reopens, and the membrane begins again to ache. Jung described in his commentary on the Mysterium the way the psyche generates, during the nigredo phase, hallucinatory consolations that look like genuine perception The alchemists called these the false dawns. They are the moments in the dissolution when something appears to be resolving, when in fact the dissolution has only paused for a moment before resuming. The empath in the quiet collapse is vulnerable to the false dawn in a specific form. The form is the imagined need of the other. The imagined need is the most powerful reactivator the system has. Because it bypasses every defense, you cannot reasonably refuse to respond to a need that, in your construction, exists. You will respond, and in responding, you will reopen everything. The internal mechanism that allows the 1% to survive is not strength, it is not discipline. It is a particular kind of perceptual skepticism that develops slowly during the collapse itself. The skepticism is directed not at others but at one's own intuitions about others. The empath begins to notice that her sense of what people need is unusually responsive to her own discomfort with silence. She begins to notice that her intuitions arrive most powerfully on the days when the absence is most acute. She begins to notice that the intuitions are not reports from the field. They are productions of the membrane attempting to reopen itself. This is the work of part 2, and it is harder than the work of part 1. In part 1, the collapse arrived. It did its initial work. The membrane closed. In part 2, the membrane is tested by the very faculty that used to keep it open. The intuitive function, which the empath has always trusted, becomes the saboteur. The function does not know it is sabotaging. It believes it is helping. It is broadcasting into the silence the constructed emergencies that would, if acted upon, restore the participation mystique. The empath who survives does not stop intuiting. She begins, for the first time, to subject her intuitions to interrogation. A patient once described this stage to her analyst in a single image. She said it felt as though someone inside her chest was holding a phone, and the phone was ringing, and she could not see the screen, but she knew, the way she had always known, who was on the other end. The analyst asked her what would happen if she did not answer. She said, "The person will think I am dead." The analyst asked, "Has anyone said this?" She said, "No, I just know." The analyst asked, "How do you know?" She said, "I have always known." The analyst said, "That is what we are looking at. The image is precise. The intuitive function has been, for decades, an instrument of relational maintenance. It has been telling the empath who needs her, when they need her, how badly. It has been right often enough that its accuracy has never been seriously questioned. What the collapse reveals is that the accuracy was partial. The function was reading real signals, but it was reading them through a filter that prioritized her involvement. The filter is what the closure removes. Without the filter, the same signals are still readable, but they no longer carry the imperative. She can sense that someone is struggling without sensing that she is required. This is the structural shift that the title points to. The quiet collapse is not the closure of perception. It is the closure of obligation. The empath in part 2 is learning to perceive without being commandeered by what she perceives. The learning is awkward. She will, in the early weeks, mistake the new mode for callousness. She will worry that she has become cold. She will read articles about narcissism and wonder if she is becoming what she once fled. None of this is true. The coldness she is detecting is the temperature of perception, unaccompanied by automatic response, and that temperature is the temperature of a sealed membrane. And the sealing is what she has wanted, without knowing she wanted it. For most of her adult life, Jung wrote that the individuation process required the withdrawal of projections, but he wrote less about what happens to the carrier of other people's projections when the carrying stops. The carrier is not the projector, the carrier is the one who has been receiving the projections, metabolizing them, returning them in a digestible form. The empath has been a carrier. Her psyche has been doing for the systems around her the digestion that those systems were unwilling to do for themselves. When the digestion stops, the systems do not collapse immediately. They simply begin to accumulate undigested material. The accumulation is not the carrier's problem, but the carrier will, in part 2, be tempted to make it her problem. The temptation arrives as guilt. The guilt is not moral, it is structural. The carrier has, for decades, used her digestive capacity to regulate the affective temperature of her environment. When the regulation stops, the temperature rises. She can feel the rise. Her trained nervous system reads the rise as a signal that something is wrong. And the something that is wrong, in her old framework, is always her insufficiency. She has not done enough. She has not been present enough. She has not absorbed enough. The guilt is the residue of the old contract, surfacing now that the contract has ended. The empath who survives learns to recognize the guilt as residue rather than as message. The recognition is not theoretical, it is somatic. She begins to notice that the guilt arrives with a specific texture, that it has a particular location in the body, that it follows a predictable timeline after a refusal or a silence. She begins to map it the way one maps a recurring weather pattern. The mapping does not eliminate the guilt, it strips the guilt of its authority. The guilt continues to arrive, but it no longer carries the verdict it used to carry. It is information about an old system, not instruction for a current one. This is what Jung meant in a phrase he used in his later seminars, when he spoke of the affect that has been seen through. The affect does not disappear. It loses its grip. It can still be felt, but it can no longer compel. The empath in part 2 is seeing through the guilt that used to compel her. She is seeing through the imagined emergencies that used to mobilize her. She is seeing through her own intuitions about who needs her, recognizing the partiality of those intuitions for the first time. The seeing through is the internal mechanism by which the membrane stays closed. There is one further mechanism, and it is the one that distinguishes the survivors most sharply. The empath in part 2 begins to notice that she has, without intending to, become less interesting to the people who used to depend on her. The noticing is not painful. which is itself the shock she had expected the noticing to wound. It does not. She had expected the diminished interest of others to feel like rejection. It does not. It feels, instead, like accuracy. The people who depended on her access are less interested in her now because there is less to extract. She is no longer producing the digestible affect they came for. They are correctly perceiving that the supply has ended and they are reallocating their attention. The reallocation is not betrayal. It is the natural movement of an extractive economy when its source goes dry. What the empath registers, watching this reallocation, is not loss. It is the strange and almost embarrassing recognition that the relationships she thought were relationships were, in significant part, supply chains. The recognition is humiliating only for a moment. After that moment, it becomes structural information. She understands, finally, what she had been participating in. She understands why the participation had felt for so long like exhaustion disguised as love. The membrane holds, the intuitions are interrogated, the guilt is mapped and disempowered. The reallocation is allowed to proceed. This is the work of part 2. And the work continues into part 3, where the cost of survival becomes visible. The cost of survival is not what the recovery literature describes. The literature describes a graduation, a clearing, a sense of arrival at a more authentic self. The cost is the opposite of graduation. The cost is the discovery, slow and unromantic, that the self that survives the quiet collapse is not the self that was always there underneath, waiting to emerge. There was no self underneath. There was only the carrier, and now there is the absence of the carrier, and the absence is what must be inhabited. This is the harshest distinction in the entire arc, and most of the surviving empaths do not name it for years. They know something is wrong with the standard narrative, but they cannot, at first, say what. The standard narrative promises that beneath the people-pleasing, beneath the over-functioning, beneath the chronic attunement to others, there is a true self with its own desires, its own preferences, its own clear directionality. The narrative assumes that removing the false structure will reveal the authentic one. The narrative is wrong about empaths of this particular type. The empath shaped by structural permeability does not have a buried authentic self waiting underneath. She has, instead, a developmental gap. The years that would have produced the personal self, the self with preferences and desires not calibrated to others, were spent producing the carrier. The carrier is not a mask over the true face. The carrier is the face that grew, because that face was what the environment selected for. Beneath the carrier is not a hidden person. Beneath the carrier is a young psyche that never finished forming, because its forming was interrupted by the demand to be useful before it was allowed to be specific. Jung wrote about this kind of arrested development without using contemporary language. He described, in his work on the puer and the puella, the psyches that remain young because they were never permitted the conflict with reality that produces individuated adulthood. The empath carrier is a variation of this pattern, but the variation is important. The carrier is not young in the sense of immature. She is, in many domains, hyper mature. She has held weight her age cohort never held. She has performed adult emotional labor since childhood. The youth that remains in her is not behavioral, it is structural. It is the part of the self that never developed its own gravity, because the gravity of the surrounding system was always doing the work. This is the shadow reversal the title points toward without naming. The empath who has read the popular literature expects, in this phase, to discover her gifts. She expects to find, beneath the over-functioning, the rich inner life that was being suppressed. What she finds, instead, is a quiet room with no furniture. The room is not depressing in the clinical sense, it is empty in a structural sense. There is no preference there, because preference was never permitted to form. There is no clear desire there, because desire was always calibrated to what others would tolerate. There is no spontaneous reaching toward, because the reaching toward was, for decades, redirected outward before it could find its own object. The cost of survival is this empty room. The survivors are the ones who can sit in the room without immediately decorating it with borrowed furniture. The non-survivors decorate. They take up a new hobby, recommended by a friend. They begin a course of study, recommended by an algorithm. They enter a new relationship, recommended by the need to fill the room. Each of these is decoration. Each of them is the importation of someone else's preference into the empty room. Because the empty room is intolerable to a system trained to be full of other people's needs. The survivors leave the room empty for longer than is comfortable. They allow the emptiness to be the condition, not the problem. There is a particular shadow that arises in this stage, and it is the shadow most often missed. The shadow is resentment, but not the resentment one might expect. It is not resentment of the people who extracted. That resentment, when it arises, is straightforward. It can be named, mapped, processed. The deeper resentment is directed at the self. The empath, in the empty room, begins to resent the part of her that consented to the carrying. She begins to resent the child who learned too early that she would be loved for what she absorbed. She begins to resent the adolescent who refined the absorption into a vocation. She begins to resent the adult who built a career, a marriage, a friendship circle on the absorption, who never questioned the absorption, who took the absorption for sensitivity and the sensitivity for identity. This is the shadow Jung described in Aeon as the moral problem that cannot be solved by displacement. The empath has spent decades displacing the shadow onto the people who used her. The displacement was accurate enough to be useful. They did use her. They were extractive. The naming of them is not wrong, but the naming of them is not the whole truth. And part 3 is where the rest of the truth becomes available. The rest of the truth is that the carrier participated in her own use, that her participation was structured by survival but became, over time, something more than survival, that there was a kind of pleasure in being indispensable, a kind of identity in being the one who could be relied on, a kind of safety in being so necessary that abandonment was logistically inconvenient. The empath who survives has to look at this without flinching. The looking is not for the purpose of self-blame. Self-blame is another displacement. The looking is for the purpose of structural understanding. She participated. She does not need to apologize for the participation. The participation kept her alive in environments that would have otherwise destroyed her. But the participation also produced the carrier, and the carrier is what is now being dismantled. And the dismantling cannot complete itself while the participation remains invisible to the one who participated. A second dream, less recent than the first, returns to her in the early weeks of part 3. She is standing in a house that is hers but unfamiliar. The rooms are full of furniture she did not buy. She walks from room to room and recognizes nothing. In one room there is a chair she has never seen, but the chair has the imprint of her body in the cushion. The imprint is deep, as though she has sat in the chair for years. She wakes with the question, whose chair was that? The question is rhetorical. The chair was hers in the sense that she occupied it. The chair was not hers in the sense that she chose it. The dream is naming the structure of the carrier sat in the chairs others provided. The chairs took the shape of her body. The body took the shape of the chairs. By the time she stood up, she did not know which shape had been original. The cost of survival is the willingness to not know which shape was original. The non-survivors need to know. They construct, retroactively, a story of who they would have been without the extraction. The story is consoling but invented. The survivors decline to invent. They sit with the not knowing. They accept that the carrier was, in some real sense, who they became, and that becoming was not separable from the conditions that produced it. There is no clean self underneath the carrier, because the carrier was the self. What comes next is not the recovery of the buried self. What comes next is the slow construction of a new self in a room that has, for the first time, been left empty long enough. This is where Jung's work on the second half of life becomes operationally useful, not theoretically interesting. He wrote that the second half of life is not a continuation of the first half, but a reversal of its priorities. The first half builds the persona, the social functioning, the contracts with the world. The second half is the phase in which those contracts are renegotiated or cancelled, and in which the building turns inward. The empath who survives the quiet collapse is doing the work of the second half, whether or not she would have chosen to do it. The collapse forced the schedule. The work begins now in the empty room, with no model for what the new building should look like. The shadow reversal is complete when the empath stops looking for the model. The looking for the model is the last form of the old participation mystique. It is the search for the external template that will tell her what to build. The survivors give up the search not because they are confident, but because they have noticed that every template they import produces within months a low-grade version of the old exhaustion. The templates are made for carriers. They are designed to fill empty rooms with structures that require maintenance, the maintenance, structurally the same as the maintenance she just escaped. In subtler form, what replaces the template is something the popular literature has no word for. Because the popular literature is not written for the 1%, the replacement is a kind of slow, structural specificity that develops without announcement. The empath begins to notice that certain books are intolerable to her now, and certain others have become indispensable, and that the distinction does not align with any taste she previously declared. She notices that certain rooms in her own house are unusable to her, and that she has, without planning to, begun spending all her time in one room that she never previously favored. She notices that certain people, including some she has known for decades, exhaust her even in brief contact, and certain others, including some she would not have predicted, do not. The specificity is arriving, but it is arriving in a language she does not yet speak fluently. This is what Jung meant by the function that has not yet been integrated. The empath spent her life leading with the function that allowed her to read others. The other functions, the ones that would have produced personal preference, personal aesthetic, personal directionality, were not selected for, and so they remained undeveloped. They are not absent, they are unpracticed. Part 3 is when they begin to practice. The practice is awkward. The empath who has been articulate about other people's inner lives discovers she cannot, at first, describe her own. The descriptions come out borrowed. She abandons them mid-sentence. She tries again. She is, at 55 or 60, doing the developmental work her younger self was not permitted to do. The cost of survival is the willingness to do this work without dignity. The non-survivors require dignity. They require that the work look like growth, look like progress, look like something they could report to a friend and have the friend nod with recognition. The work does not look like anything. The work looks like a woman sitting in a quiet room for an unreasonable amount of time, reading a book she does not finish, then closing the book, then starting another, then closing that one too, then sitting longer. The work is not photogenic. The work is not narrativizable. The work is the slow accumulation of a self in a body that, for the first time in decades, is not being asked to be useful. What the survivors gain in this phase is not freedom. Freedom is the wrong word. Freedom implies the absence of constraint. And the empath in part 3 is heavily constrained by her own newly developing preferences, by the limits of what she can now tolerate, by the things she has discovered she will not, under any circumstances, do again. What she gains is something the old language does not name. The closest word is gravity. She is acquiring her own gravity. The gravity is what was missing in the carrier. The carrier moved in the gravitational field of others. The survivor begins, slowly, to exert a field of her own. The field is not impressive. It does not draw people. It does, however, hold her in place when the old systems probe to see if she can be moved. The probing continues. By the way, the probing does not end in part 2. It intensifies in part 3 because the probers are by now confused. The supply they expected to be restored has not been restored. The carrier they relied on has not returned. They begin, some of them, to escalate. They send messages of unusual length. They make appearances they would not previously have made. They reach for the affect that used to be reliably produced, and when it is not produced, they reach harder. The empath who survives watches this without responding. She is not cruel. She is simply no longer manufacturing what they came for, and her not manufacturing is, now, a structural fact about her, not a decision she is making in each moment. This is the difference between part 2 and part 3. In part 2, the not manufacturing required vigilance. In part 3, the not manufacturing has become the new resting state. The membrane does not need to be held closed. It is closed. The intuitions about who needs her have quieted. The guilt has been mapped so thoroughly that it arrives like weather, expected and uninteresting. The probers can probe. The probing no longer reaches anything that responds. What remains at the end of part 3 is the question of what to do with the gravity that is now forming. The question is not yet answerable. The gravity is too new, but the question has, for the first time in her life, to become legitimately hers. The cost of survival has been paid. The empty room is still empty, but it has, somewhere in the silence, begun to acquire weight. The weight that the empty room acquires is the first form of what Jung called, in his late commentary on the conjunctio, the inner authority that does not require external confirmation. He did not write much about it directly, because he understood that writing about it tended to produce imitations. The inner authority is not a state the empath enters. It is a structural property that develops in her absence from the systems that previously defined her. She does not notice it forming. She notices, instead, that certain reactions have stopped occurring in her body, and that certain other reactions have begun to occur, and that the new reactions are coming from somewhere she cannot locate but recognizes as hers. The first sign is small. She is sent a message that 6 months earlier would have produced an immediate internal mobilization. The mobilization does not occur. She reads the message. She notices its content. She notices, with mild interest, that her body has not braced. There is no surge of preparation. There is no rehearsing of the response. There is only the message sitting in her field of attention, and her field of attention treating it as information rather than as summons. She does not, at first, trust this. She waits for the delayed reaction. The delayed reaction does not arrive. She closes the phone. She returns to whatever she was doing. The whatever she was doing is no longer interrupted by the message in the way it used to be. This is the structural change that part 4 is concerned with. The change is not psychological in the sense that something has shifted in how she thinks. The change is in how the nervous system organizes itself in response to demand. The demand arrives, the system processes it, the system declines to mobilize. The declining is not a decision, it is a new default, the membrane that closed in part 1, that was tested in part 2, that was inhabited in part 3, has become operational. It is doing what membranes do. It is filtering. The filtering is not vigilant, it is structural. The empath in part 4 is no longer in the collapse, she is in what follows the collapse, which the title gestures toward without describing. The title speaks of surviving the collapse. The survival, properly understood, is not a destination. It is the condition of having become a person who can no longer be returned to the previous arrangement. The previous arrangement required the carrier. The carrier is gone. What stands in her place is not impressive. It is not radiant. It is simply a self that exerts its own small gravity and is no longer interpretable by the systems that read the carrier. Jung wrote in one of his late letters that the individuated person is recognized not by what she possesses, but by what no longer reaches her. The phrase is precise. The empath who has completed the arc is recognized by what no longer reaches her. The phone calls reach the phone but do not reach her. The accusations reach the air but do not reach her interior. The bids for the old supply reach the door of the membrane and do not pass through. She is, in this specific sense, harder to find, not because she is hiding, because the address by which she used to be locatable has been retired. There is a third dream, and it comes late in the arc, and it is short. She is walking on a road she does not recognize. The road is plain. There are no symbols on it. There are no figures waiting. She reaches a point where the road continues, and she keeps walking. She wakes and notices that the dream contained nothing dramatic. The dream contained a woman walking. She understands, on waking, that this is the dream. The drama has left, that what remains is movement that does not need to mean anything beyond itself. The dream is not a message. The dream is a structural report. The psyche is telling her that the heroic phase is over. The work now is ordinary continuation. This is what Jung meant in his rare moments of plain speech, when he said that individuation does not produce a special person, it produces an ordinary person who has stopped looking elsewhere for what she is. The empath in part 4 has stopped looking elsewhere. She is not enlightened. She is not transcendent. She is, in the most literal sense, here is a small word. It describes a vast structural achievement. She is in her own body, in her own house, in her own week. And the body and house and week are no longer subcontracted to the maintenance of relationships that required her absence from them. The cost of this, which part 3 named, has been paid. What part 4 contains is not reward. There is no reward. the system that would have provided reward, the participation mystique that returned admiration in exchange for supply, has been dismantled. The new arrangement does not provide admiration, it provides accuracy. The empath can now perceive what is happening around her without the perception being instrumentalized for relational maintenance. She can notice that a friend is struggling without being conscripted into the struggle. She can notice that a family member is reaching without converting the noticing into obligation. The perception remains intact. The perception has been freed from its old contract. This is the part the popular literature most misunderstands. The popular literature suggests that healed empaths become less perceptive, that the sealing of the membrane reduces sensitivity. The opposite is true, and it is one of the original distinctions worth naming. The carrier was not maximally sensitive, the carrier was maximally responsive. The two are different. Responsiveness is sensitivity rooted through obligation. Sensitivity without obligation is more accurate because it is no longer distorted by the survival pressure to convert every perception into a useful action. The empath in part 4 perceives more, not less. She acts less, not more. The ratio between perception and action has been recalibrated. The recalibration is the structural achievement. What she does with the perception now is the question that arrives at the end of the arc. The question does not have a single answer. Some of the survivors write, some teach, some take on a small number of relationships and tend them carefully. Some withdraw from most contact and arrange their lives around solitude that is no longer a deprivation. Some return to families they had distanced from on entirely new terms, holding the contradiction Jung called the both and, where the family member is loved and not granted access in the old way. Some begin work they could not have done as carriers, work that requires the kind of concentration the old contract did not permit. The shape varies, the structural property does not. The property is that the action, whatever its shape, is now hers. There is a question that surfaces in this phase that the empath has not asked before. The question is not, what do they need? The question is not, what should I do? The question is, what is mine? The question is asked without melodrama. It is asked the way one asks a practical question about one's own house. It is asked again the next day, and the next, and the asking is not a crisis. It is the beginning of the new functioning. The carrier never asked this question. The carrier asked what was needed, and the needed was always external. The survivor asks what is hers, and the hers is interior, and the interior is finally being treated as a legitimate site of inquiry. The systems that depended on the carrier will, by this stage, have mostly moved on. Some of them will have collapsed. Some will have found new suppliers. Some will have reorganized around the absence in ways the empath cannot see and is not required to see. Occasionally, one of them will resurface. A message will arrive after 18 months of silence. The message will be carefully constructed. It will contain an apology or an explanation or an offering. The empath in part 4 reads the message without internal mobilization. She notices its construction. She notices what it is asking for, which is rarely what it claims to be asking for. She declines to respond in the old register. Sometimes she responds briefly. Sometimes she does not respond at all. The decision is not moral, it is structural. The old register is no longer available. Regardless of how skillfully the message is constructed, what she has lost, by this point, she does not particularly miss. She thought she would. In part 1 and part 2, she anticipated grief over the lost relationships, over the diminished social field, over the people who used to call and have stopped. The grief did not arrive in the form she expected. What arrived instead was a clearer perception of what those relationships had actually consisted of. The clearer perception did not produce grief, it produced something closer to a clinical interest. She understands now what was happening. The understanding does not make her bitter. It also does not make her nostalgic. It places her in factual relation to a period of her life that has ended. Jung wrote in the Mysterium that the final stage of the alchemical work was not the production of gold, but the production of the philosophical stone, which he interpreted as the symbol of the integrated psyche. The stone is not a possession. The stone is a structure that has settled. The empath in part 4 has settled. The settling is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is recognized only by the fact that she no longer leaves herself in order to manage the affect of others. She remains in her own body during conversations she once would have abandoned mid-sentence. She remains in her own preferences during meals she once would have eaten only to please the host. She remains in her own week during the periods when the old systems would have summoned her. And she does not feel the summons, because the address by which they used to summon her has been retired. This is what the title was pointing to from the beginning. Though the title used the language of survival, because survival is the language the audience could understand on first encounter. What the empath has actually done is not survive. She has, more precisely, become structurally inaccessible to the arrangement that previously required her. The arrangement may still exist, it may still operate, it may still extract from others who have not yet collapsed. She is no longer one of its operating components. The inaccessibility is the achievement. The achievement does not need to be celebrated. It is not legible to the people who would celebrate it. And the people to whom it is legible are doing the same work in their own quiet rooms and do not need it announced. 1% is a number that overstates the precision and understates the truth. The number is meant to suggest rarity. The rarity is not because the work is impossibly difficult. The rarity is because the work is structurally invisible from inside the participation mystique. Those still inside the participation mystique cannot see what the work would consist of, because the work consists of the cessation of the very activity that the participation mystique requires for its perception of value: to not respond, to not absorb, to not metabolize, to not perform the relational labor. Looks from inside like failure. The 1% are the ones who continued past the appearance of failure into the structural reality on the other side. She closes the book she has been reading. The book did not finish its argument. She does not mind. She walks through her house, which is hers, in a way it has not previously been. The chairs are chairs she chose. The walls hold light she chose. The phone is silent. The silence is not loneliness. The silence is the absence of broadcast, and the absence of broadcast is the condition under which her actual life can finally take place. The carrier has ended. The arrangement that required her cannot resume.
This has been Carl Jung Original, a space where the patterns most people live through can finally be named. Voice and imagery, AI assisted interpretation and framing, original work. Until next lecture.